In the name of the law, I order you to stop. You are under arrest. Hello, my fellow game masters. My name is Guy, and of course you're watching, How to Be a Great GM. And today we're talking about the law. Now, the law is always going to be a difficult situation because your PCs, it doesn't really matter what system they're in, they're oftentimes on the shady side of the law, to put it mildly. Sometimes they just blatantly fly in the face of it. So how do we reconcile a complete society, a flourishing spaceport, a medieval castle, a private little estate in the 1930s? How do we reconcile the law, or guards, or towns guards, or soldiers? How do we bring it together with the actual game so that we don't end up with conflict, and so that ultimately our PCs don't get arrested and executed for, well, various crimes and things? There are a couple of things that we need to take into account when we look at the law, and these are the ways that I try to use the law so that it's still present, it's still a threat, it's still something that the PCs need to worry about, but I'm not painting myself into a corner so that should they get arrested, they then are going to get sent away for 20 years of solitary confinement, especially if that's not what I want to have happen in my game. So I look at these three things. I look at the law of the law, I look at lawmen, and then I look at the technical, almost metagame aspect of a legal system and how that all sort of comes together and works. So let's go into it. So if we look at actually the law of the law, what is the judicial system? What sits in your realm? And there's a lot of role-playing options that you can come up with because ultimately it's your world. So might you have a judicial system where you are guilty until proven innocent? Perhaps you even have a judicial system where the facts don't actually matter and it's the standing of the individual who's presenting the case. This might sound very strange, but in medieval Europe, that's pretty much how it worked. If a lord accused a peasant of stealing, it didn't really matter whether the peasant had been found with or without the object, whether there were witnesses or not, or, well, whether the peasant was even in the same country at the time. The noble was automatically believed, and the peasant was dismissed, well, executed, or had a hand lobbed off, or sent to the pillory, or wherever it might be, but generally there wasn't much focus on due process. Now, in science fiction settings, where one arguably has more advanced societies, and thus usually more complex laws, you also don't necessarily want to have a system where it's 500 pages of litigation and clauses and subclauses and all those kinds of things as well. I think if you just generally have an idea as to how the law works, then that gives you a good sense of where you're going to find loopholes for your PCs to escape through, basically. Now, the important thing to realize is that I'm not going to go into every single judicial system that exists out there, whether you are innocent until proven guilty, where the burden of proof lies, all those kinds of things. I'm going to leave up to you to go and Google and find out how we do it here on Earth. And we've got some very different systems. There are jury systems where it's a bunch of 12 people deciding the guilt of a person. We have other systems where the judge makes all of the decisions and can be as fallible, if not more so, than with a jury of people. There are all kinds of ways and means of doing it, and, well, it's up to you to kind of impart that flavor into your world. And I do think that there is a tremendous space there for you to add your own take on things. Now, when we talk about the reach of the law, we're talking about two things fundamentally. But firstly, with the reach of the law, it's how pervasive is the law within that land. If you're playing in a fantasy setting or even a Western setting, if you think of the Wild West, the law was basically the sheriff, and that extended to the boundaries of the town and maybe the few farms around that town. But beyond that, you then had the marshals, who kind of had this overriding power to hunt down criminals, execute those criminals, and then basically move on to the next target. And they could sort of cross territories. You had, well, some of the marshals couldn't move between the different states, and you have how far the law goes. That's important to realize, that that's going to have a big impact on your game. If the townsfolk only really care about the law within their town, well, that's one thing, and that allows the PCs to get to the town's border and basically snub their noses at the lawmen who get to the dead zone, I suppose, and can go no further. If it's a galaxy-wide empire, how do you then do it? How do you then reconcile the fact that wherever the PCs go, they will be hunted down by the law? Again, we will hold off judgment on that until we get to the technical section of this video. But the reach of the law also talks to how deep into society does it go? Is the law absolutely everywhere? Is the law present on the streets, but behind closed doors there isn't much of a presence? Again, depending on the society, and what a wonderful flavouring it can add to your societies, where you have, for example, and I'm going to look to say a Star Trekian example, where they have the Romulans, which are these incredibly paranoid people, but who take great delight in reporting on their neighbours. Oh, my neighbours are doing this, which I'm sure is illegal. So that's how far the legal system sort of permeates into that society, so that you basically can't do a thing without somebody noticing it, noting it, and reporting it. That is an incredibly difficult space for PCs to operate in. And if you have an environment like that, I would advise, and this is a little bit premature, but I would advise that you don't set up the PCs to fail in that space. And you have to make sure that they really, 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 really know what they're doing. And basically, well, what has been established, and you need to establish it up front. And that often can be done by the guards at the front gate or at the starport entrance, where they list very briefly, again, not 500 pages of litigation, but where they list or legislation or legalities or judicial process, all that kind of stuff. You don't have to go into that too much. Where they list, you realize committing any form of crime here is punishable by death. Those kinds of things. Then we need to look at the process. Now, this is not the actual step-by-step. The guards have to read out the rights of the individual being arrested in the language of the individual within 30 seconds of the individual being handcuffed, all that kind of nonsense. We're not looking at that. What we're looking at is, again, spaces and places and points within the judicial process that we can utilize to make sure that our PCs can potentially walk free. Now, again, I say this because oftentimes, as I have said before, the PCs are against the actual nature of the law. So the process might be, there is a crime that's committed. There is an alarm that gets sounded. The guards, the police force, arrive on the scene, and then they have to investigate and potentially need to then question everyone who was present. They don't arrest them, they question them. They're then released. The investigation then takes several weeks, and then only do they move in terms of arrest. So what it is, they have been found red-handed. Again, the PCs are often found red-handed, covered in the blood of their enemies. Those enemies might not be recognized by the law as actually being criminals, and so the PCs have just become criminals without real chance of exoneration. So the process then is that they get arrested, they're going to get put into a prison cell. Then in the prison cell they go through a trial, and at the end of the trial they then get sent to another prison cell. That's the process that you need to have in the back of your mind, so that at the point of when the police force arrive, how diligent are they in terms of rounding up suspects? Once they've got the suspects, do they interrogate them and then let them go? Do they immediately arrest them and take them off to prison? In the prison, what is the security like in the local police station or guard station rather than at a maximum security prison? In the courts, what's the process there? So that at each step, if the PCs find themselves there, you as the GM have got NPCs ready and waiting to potentially step in and save the day if needs be. Now, I'm holding off on why and how you should do that for the third half of this video, so stay with me. So once we've established all of this, we need to make sure that our PCs are aware of it. And like I have said before, you're not giving them a book of rules, although sometimes those can definitely help, especially if the PCs are actually in the law enforcement, in which case then you are obliged and required, and it's going to make your life a lot easier. Trust me from experience, I know this. Have those up front available for the PCs before they start playing. The general handbook, the rule book, it doesn't have to be a gigantic document. It just needs to be enough that those PCs can actually integrate with the system. So then we look at the actual lawmen. So we've now got our legal structure, so we can figure out, okay, right, so this is the process and this is how it works. How do we then take it to the next level? How do we then make sure that the actual law enforcement themselves don't end up getting slaughtered by the PCs? And how do they react to the PCs? So the first and most important thing is the response time. Now, on planet Earth, the response time of law enforcement is variable all over the place. In some places, it's less than 10 minutes. In other places, it's more than an hour. In some places, it depends on the crime. Oh, there's been a burglary. All right, we'll arrive within the next 3 days. Oh, there's been a murder. Yeah, we'll get there in the next 10 minutes. We'll get there in the next hour. There's currently a hostage situation. We will respond a lot faster or a lot slower, depending. Oh, it's in a poor district. We're not going to respond at all. It's just where we don't go there. So you've got to look at the response times, and they need to be plausible. If you have a city where you've set out with the law of the law that is a pervasive, very legal-based city, a very ordered-based city, whether it's in space or in 1960s, now, present day, or in the past, it's a very structured, very focused space. So you need to figure out, okay, well, what is the response time and to what do they respond? Now, something that's actually important here is because a lot of our games share a certain mystical element, a magical element, a fantastical element, even in science fiction, which is probably more appropriately called science fantasy if you look at things like Starfinder, Star Wars, or even Star Trek with all the telepathy running around. Even in those kinds of situations, you may have to have a specific part of the police force that's dedicated just to that. Now, where does that inspiration come from? Well, as a matter of fact, my home country of South Africa still has a division within the police force that's dedicated to magic crimes. There's a very large amount of mysticism and cultural what's the word that I'm looking for? The culture still has a strong belief in magical beings, in the power of the spirit world and so forth, and so certain crimes can be committed under the umbrella of a magic crime. Many other cultures and countries have this as well. It really depends on the people who live there and what they believe in. That unit will only respond to specific crimes that are suspected of being related to magic or the superstitious world, that kind of space. Do you have the same thing in your campaign? If so, your magic police might be armed differently and might respond differently as well. If local cops show up, local guards, they arrive and they go, oh, hang on a moment, this is all just a little bit too above our pay grade. No, we're going to have to wait for the Ghostbusters to arrive. We need them before we actually go inside that building. What is that doing? All it's doing is it's A, creating a tremendous amount of flavor for your setting, but B, it's also giving you, the GM, the opportunity to allow the PCs to sneak out the back door. The local guards are not going to touch this. They've seen green fire bursting out of the 5th story window. They're not going to go in there. They know that that's above their pay grade. It could be demons, it could be witches, it could be who knows what. It's above us. We've got to wait for the experts to arrive. In that delay, the PCs could escape. Now, I know making it sound as if the PCs should always be able to escape. That isn't what I'm saying. If the PCs genuinely commit a murder in broad daylight in the middle of the street, as far as everyone else who's watching them is concerned, they should become hunted by the law. And that's what then brings us to our intelligence level. Now, the intelligence level is effectively the intelligence level of the cops. Now, even in our own theatrical productions, you will have shows where the cops are not particularly sharp, they're not particularly intelligent, they're rather dim, dull, and represent the lowest common denominator of society. On the other hand, when you watch shows that are exonerating and that are lauding our dedicated policemen and lawmen, they are incredibly intelligent and have to outwit, and generally always do, criminals who are also incredibly intelligent. So there's this wide polarity in terms of how the law is represented in our own entertainment, in our own fantasy, and our own literature. It should be the same in your world. Again, I maintain that you should establish this before the player characters actually enter into the town. A passing merchant goes, oh, I hope you're not going in there. Oh, their lawmen are bloody ruthless. They arrive within 3 minutes of the alarm bell going up, and they're as sharp as tacks they are. You've got to be very careful operating in that city. If you're thinking of doing anything a little bit below the legal line, I'd suggest you turn around and head on over to that other city over there. That's just a hive of scum and villainy. You can get away with anything over there, but over there, oh boy, you can barely wipe your nose without getting into trouble. So the intelligence level allows you to then play around with the PCs being able to smart talk their way out of a situation. Perhaps the PCs can not even smart talk, maybe they can explain the situation and say, well, look, this is what happened. This person is a villain. We've definitely got proof and evidence, and we can bring it to you. In which case, maybe the lawmen tag along as NPCs for a little while, which gives you some more opportunities there for an engaging story. Or perhaps there's a certain amount of, all right, well, we hear what you're saying. We don't have reason to trust you, but it makes more sense than all of the other alternatives, so we're going to go along with it. On the other hand, if their intelligence is not very high, they can be spoken to in such a way that those are not the guards that anyone is looking for, or those are not the droids, I should say, and everyone can pass and be merry. And that, of course, then brings us to corruption. Just how corrupt is the legal system? Can judges be bribed? Can the lawmen be bribed? The guards arrive on scene, someone throws out a handful of coins, and the guards go away. Or the guards arrive, someone throws out a handful of coins, and the guards arrest them on bribery charges as well as on the actual crime that they were committed. Again, setting this up before the PCs start to do anything is absolutely vital, because otherwise the PCs are going to feel a little bit hard done by, especially in medieval settings or in fantasy settings, because there's a general feeling that there was a lack of intelligence amongst fantasy guards and things. And I think that's because, again, it's what we've been exposed to. Usually the heroes are Robin Hood style heroes who are breaking into castles. So they can't have guards that are particularly intelligent. Did you hear a noise? No, it must have been the wind. Let's go back to standing at the door. That kind of thing. So corruption, again, also can be established quite easily. You walking down the street and you see two guards standing outside a fruit cellar, and the fruit seller is handing them money and apples to sort of indicate that is present and that is something that can be doable. The whole idea here is that you don't want the PCs to get bogged down in legalese so that they don't actually act within the city, or that once they have acted, that you are not forced by virtue of having established rather rigid systems to then follow through and actually execute the PCs. It gives you options to break away and go, oh, okay, yes, this is how I'm going to get the PCs out of it. This is how I'm going to get the pieces out of it. And when I say how you're going to get the PCs out of it, I mean how you are going to present opportunities for the PCs and for their players to figure out how to get out of it on their own, just so that we're absolutely clear. Then we need to look at the technical aspect of it all. Now, this is where we step away a little bit more in terms of being a metagame GM rather than focusing on the narrative and on the story, because it is all part of the same idea if you think about it. But when we talk about the focus of the game, if the lore is the focus of the game, then you need to make sure that you've written out all of the laws beforehand, that you have those available for the PCs if they would normally have access to them, that you have figured out this whole system. Now, games that have law enforcement as a principal kind of underwriting focus, I suppose you could say, would be if you've got games that are set in prisons. Prisons will have all of the judicial systems in place. They'll have processes in place. You're going to have different types of guards that allow the PCs to engage or not engage. So there's those kinds of things that you should have in place already. It also depends on whether you want the PCs to be chased by the law, or to be ignored by the law, or to have the law as a threat that keeps them on the straight and narrow. So that's important for you to bear in mind and to decide upon, I think, fairly early on in your campaign, or perhaps once the PCs have done something particularly horrendous, to then shift it so that you can say, all right, well, you did this in public. There is a legal system in place and it is hunting you, it is present. So that there is a sense that your world is operating beyond and about the PCs, not just for the PCs. It also makes sure that the PCs are aware that there are consequences to their actions, and you need to follow those consequences through. again, at the same time, making sure that the PCs can ultimately prevail over those consequences one way or another. And then you need to look at the actual focus of the law. Now, this is something that you decide arbitrarily. There really isn't a huge amount of, I don't want to say precedent for it, but let's say the law is only focused on catching big fish, or at least the detective is only focused on catching big fish. There are many TV shows to go and draw inspiration from, and the idea here is that let's say the party is involved in an event which would trigger the law to have to respond. A detective arrives, the party is covered in blood, the body is lying right in front of them, they're as guilty as sin. They didn't bother to respond enough in time for the alarms going off, or they didn't bother to check for the alarms that they set off, all those kinds of things. The detective arrives, the players are panicking because they're surrounded by guards. You get a sense from them that they're kind of going, oh, we screwed up and really now we're going to get arrested. How do we get out of this? Or they're going to do the worst thing, which is now start to attack the city guards and just make the entire situation even worse, because either they're going to kill all the city guards, in which case your city guards now go on alert and it changes the whole focus of your story, or they're going to die at the hands of the city guards, which completely derails your entire plot for no reason other than a slip up on behalf of the players. The detective might arrive and go, yes, I'll take care of these men, guards, you're dismissed. And then the detective basically says, I'm going to use you to catch bigger fish. So I'm going to let you go now, but I want you to carry on doing what it is you're doing. And when you're about to take out the kingpin, that's when I arrive and I arrest the kingpin. So the focus of the law becomes more around a bigger picture. And even if you didn't have a bigger picture in place, the PCs don't know all and everything that's going on. The players don't know all and everything that's going on in your campaign. So if you need a detective to arrive on the scene and almost hand out a get out of jail free card, you can do it using this kind of idea that the law is, yes, it's a petty, you murdered a street child. That's not that bad in comparison to the necromancer that we're trying to hunt down. Oh, I don't know about that, but anyway, that's the example that you're getting. Is that such a bad thing? And if so, well, can the detective use the PCs to mitigate or to exonerate them from their crimes? We still do that today. Turn state's evidence, where you are testifying against the crime lord that you used to work for, and your sentence is often reduced, commuted, or you just get a new identity and start a new life, a clean slate, if you will. So you can do that, but again, that's not something that you can do all the time. Otherwise, the PCs become complacent, the players no longer care about your legal system, and they just go about doing things on their own. So those are the things you need to look at from a metagaming perspective. And then something that you have to nerf, especially if you're running a science fiction style campaign or you're running a high fantasy campaign where there's lots of magic available and places can be booby-trapped, rigged, etc., to capture PCs who wander in without checking for traps and the like. With the legal abilities, how far does the legal ability extend? So in a science fiction environment, are there sensors everywhere? And so the investigating officer needs just to go to the computer center and download, oh, well, the computer tracked your heartbeat, your life signs, your DNA trace right throughout this entire place. I can reconstruct your entire journey. That's, again, as limiting as, say, for example, a spell which triggers as the party walks past it, and now suddenly there's this invisible eye that follows them around, tracking everything they're doing, reporting it back to the head captain of the guard or whatever the case might be. Its surveillance systems or its control systems or its confining systems that really are just beyond the scope of your game in terms of it's a once-off, they're just stealing something from the magistrate's office. Normally it would be incredibly difficult to do, but because of the story, because of the game, it shouldn't be. So sometimes you just have to look at it and go, well, you know what, they don't have very high security systems here because they don't expect it to happen. Or if they do, let's roll and see if those were actually enabled this particular day, or if there was a glitch. even if there wasn't a glitch, can the law actually access it easily? Or is it something that they have to apply to judiciary to actually give them the authority to go and actually check those sensors and scanners and things? Those are something that you can have in the back of your mind, again, just to provide alternatives and options for the PCs to be able to extricate themselves from the situation. Again, it sounds like you are basically creating a system so that you can circumnavigate that system. You pretty much are. Your job, remember, is to make sure that the PCs, and in particular the players, are having fun. And if they are going to have fun being arrested and going through due process, then that's fine. Make it happen. If they're not, though, you need to have some kind of background to be able to fall back and say, well, yes, but a detective comes in and releases you on his own recognizance. The judge is away on holiday and there isn't someone who can replace him, so you're in prison for 3 weeks. During the 3 weeks, you notice the guards are very lax around these certain times, or there's a festival that's happening, the guards are stretched thin. So by thinking about some of these things, just momentarily, it allows you to create a system that feels as if it's this mega dynamic judicial space, but which allows the players to still operate that certain freedom that comes with being a hero, as opposed to coming to being a real person in that kind of environment. Then that the law does not necessarily always get the perpetrator of the crime that they're investigating. Those are my thoughts on how to do a legal system. I think it's something that we sometimes don't pay too much attention to, but it's something that is of absolute value should the need arise to have it happen. I certainly do not advocate the fact that you just don't have the law arrive. The alarm is set off and no one shows up. It just sets a bad precedent. The PCs will just think that they can act as they will and don't have to worry about consequences. And that is the worst thing that you can do within your game. Until next time, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and join our massive legion of fans. Share our video with others. Sharing is caring, as they say. Until then, happy gaming.